Well, it has been 2 whole years since we have our Tesla Powerwalls installed on our house. So I'm going to talk about my 2 years experience with our Tesla Powerwalls. We're going to talk about why they're so important now, more than ever since we've installed them. And I'll show you what it is set up in our Tesla app, why we have it set up that way, and how much money we're actually saving per month since our electricity company has changed our electricity rates this year in 2025. Let's dive in. Let me show you the Powerwalls, and then we'll take a look behind the scenes. Hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned. Let's take a look. All right, everybody. Well, let's just start off with a quick introduction. My name is Paul here on Tech Motoring, and this is a channel primarily dealing with electric vehicles. As you can see, I have a little bit of a collection of electric vehicles, so it really does make sense for me to have solar on my roof. Our house is 100% electric. You can see behind me that we have some EVSEs here on the wall to charge our electric vehicles. We also have this tankless water heater back here. We have a 100% electric home here. And because of that, I try to save as much money as possible by implementing solar. And then 2 years ago, Tesla Powerwalls. Now you're probably wondering, why are the Tesla Powerwalls so important for saving money, right? You just send it back to the grid, you'll just get the same thing back and forth. That's not necessarily the case for me. You see, when we send our electricity back to the grid, we actually only get about 1/3 of the cost of what it would cost for us to buy that electricity. And that was something that just never sat well with me. So we would produce and produce and produce all day long from the solar on a roof that we've had for 5 years now. We would end up sending most of it back to the grid since we weren't home mostly during the day, Monday through Friday. And then we would just get 1/3 of the cost, which at the time was 10 cents per kilowatt hour when we were on our off-peak seasons. We'll get more into what the difference is between the on-peak, off-peak is now versus what it used to be. And it was 12 cents per kilowatt hour during the on-peak seasons. On-peak seasons would be the summer months when we have a lot more air conditioning being run. And of course, with it being South Carolina, we do get quite a bit of hot summer days. So the AC sometimes runs for 10, 12 hours per day, depending on the day. But what we have here now is a pretty decent setup for what we're trying to accomplish, which is produce our solar from our panels up on our roof and use that initially for the house. And then if for some reason we have some extra, we store it for future use. But that was just the initial, when we first installed it, case or use case for that electricity. Now it has become even more important than ever. And we'll go over that when we get back to the studio. First, though, I want to bring you outside. I want to show you the Tesla Powerwalls, and I want to give you an idea of where they are, how much we have, and how exactly they work when it comes to the actual wiring of them. Because if you're new to this, if you're looking for Tesla Powerwalls, then this might be something you might be interested in seeing to see if this is the proper application for you. So let's go take a look and I'll show you my setup. All right, well, here is my setup as you can see here. So this is pretty much our system here, and then as you can see, this little conduit goes up to our roof line, which is where we have our 16 solar panels. We produce in maximum 5.92 kilowatt array on top of our roof. I've done plenty of videos about that in the past. Please take a look at those if you're interested in the installation of the solar panels and my cost of them. And of course, if you want to take a look at the production over the last 5 years, I also have all that and some other videos about solar. But this is going to be primarily about the Tesla Powerwalls and how exactly this whole system works. So here you can see the conduit that comes from basically the roof. It goes into my attic and then it comes out here. This goes into my N-phase Envoy, there we go, IQ combiner box. So just to give you an idea of how this works, solar panels produce the DC. They go into the N-phase microinverters off the panels, which are AC, so it converts it to AC, goes through here, and then this goes into our Tesla gateway. The Tesla gateway then distributes it between the house, the batteries, and the grid. And so what it does is it determines, based on an algorithm, depending on my settings that I have set up, where that energy is going to go. So ideally, you want everything to go to the house because the house is calling for AC power. Therefore, sending it to the house is the most efficient route. So everything that we basically demand from solar goes directly to the house first. Then anything that is extra will get routed down here into our Tesla Powerwalls. Now you'll see how we have two Tesla Powerwalls, and these are actually Powerwall 2s. So I actually got these shortly before the Powerwall 3s had actually got announced. So these were installed, and it was like a month later that they announced the Powerwall 3s coming out. And so I got these maybe a little too early, but you know what? I got a pretty good deal on them, and even Tesla gave me a $500 each back on this purchase. So I actually got $1,000 back because I bought these in just the perfect time, area where I was qualified for that. So that was really cool for that to happen as well. So solar, this is our gateway. Gateway determines where it's going to go. So basically it's always going to be solar to the house first. Gateway will send extra to the batteries. If for some reason the batteries get full, then whatever's extra will come out of the gateway from the solar and go into our grid. And that's pretty much it. We almost never sell anything back to the grid unless for some reason we end up filling the battery up, which I try not to do too often just because of the health of the cells. I try to keep those at a pretty moderate level, probably try to keep it below 90% most of the time. And of course, we always keep like a 20% buffer at the bottom during the longer days of the year. And then in the wintertime, I'll try to keep like a 25% buffer at the bottom. That's all adjustable in the app, which I can show you that in the next part of this video. But yeah, so this is our current setup. We have our conduit, gateway for the Tesla, Powerwalls, and then, of course, our grid connection, which we still require the grid. We're only producing, like I said, under 6 kilowatt maximum. And so we still require a grid connection because we're not anywhere near what we can do to go off grid per se. Anyway, that is our setup here. Let's go up to the studio and talk about the Tesla app and how it functions with all of this stuff.
All right, everybody, welcome to the studio now, where we're going to go over my 2 years experience and break down how it's been saving me money, and basically the overall impressions of owning two Tesla Powerwall 2s over the course of the last 2 years. And I'll show you why it's more important now than ever that we actually have these on our house, from not only a savings perspective, but also from a redundancy perspective, a redundant power source to power our house. So real quick, we live on the east coast of South Carolina, close to the beach. We are very prone to hurricanes, so we do have quite a few hurricanes per year, some of which that do touch down in this area and can cause some power disruptions and or outages for short to extended period of times. It's always all over the place, we just never know. But we do have hurricanes that do touch base. Now, the last couple of years, we actually haven't had any major hurricanes that hit this area, which has been actually kind of nice, obviously. But at the same time, that means we haven't been able to really fully test the Powerwalls. Now, we've had probably about a handful of power outages in the past year and a half or so that have tested the Powerwall's capabilities and have shown that they can keep our house up and running during a complete power outage or grid failure. And with that, let's kind of dive into the way the Tesla app looks, how it works, and let's see exactly how this works for us. All right, so as you can see here on the screen, we have our house here, which is obviously showing that we have our Tesla Model 3 that's currently plugged into our Tesla Universal Wall Connector down in the garage. You can see our solar that's incoming from our production right now. So I guess we have a cloud overhead, so we'll see that number creep up here in a little bit. We could see our home demand, which is right now 8 kilowatts. Now we have the AC running. The car is downstairs charging at a little bit. I think it's about 24 amps right now. So you could see that we have some demand. Now you can see that we're pulling from the grid all of that demand right now. And the reason for that is because we are currently in our off-peak hours of the day. So from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. for 4 months out of the year, we have our on-peak hours. And then for the other months of the year, we have from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. those peak hours. Now we'll go more into depth in a little bit when we see our schedule built out. So you'll see that we're not pulling from the Powerwall right now because our rates are so cheap. We pull from the grid and then we save the Powerwall battery for those 3 hours per day. And I want to talk about how there could be some improvements on that, hopefully in future iterations of this application. So that is our layout, as you could see here. So now you can visualize it from the app standpoint now that I showed you it physically outside of our house. Let's go into the energy section here. This shows you obviously everything. You can see the house demand. You can see the car demand. So you had a little bit of a peak today. The reason that you see that little peak for that little short while is because we actually have something called charge on solar, something that the Tesla vehicles, if you have Tesla Powerwalls, a really cool feature that allows you to charge your vehicle from the excess solar. So if you're producing excess solar and your house doesn't need all of it, it can send the rest of it directly to your vehicle, which is a pretty cool feature. And I do use it quite a bit on the weekends or during the week when I leave my car home and I take my other vehicle to work. This one usually sits at home and just charges off of the excess solar that we produce. We also see our battery here. We can see that we have had some adjustments throughout the day of charging up the battery. You can see there's a little bit of a large charging up here because I think that was in between us running our dryer and some other stuff. And then before I plugged the car in, here you can see our solar for today. So you can see how it goes up and up and up towards the afternoon. And then we max out today. Now keep in mind, this is the end of September and we're looking at about 3.6 kilowatt is what we peaked today. We'll probably peak a little bit higher today, maybe closer to about 4 kilowatt. But it looks like we do have some dips in it today because we have some random cloud coverage. The next one is our grid. So this shows us what we're pulling from the grid and how much. This shows you the day. You could just organize it by month, year, lifetime, or you could do custom dates, however you want to do it. But it's really nice to be able to see all these metrics right in this one menu here. We go to impact. So impact shows all your metrics of how much power you used that came from solar, how much came from the Powerwall, how much came from the grid. It breaks it all down, kind of gives you how much your kilowatt hours are, how much your estimated value is, your solar production and everything. And then at the bottom here, it shows our backup history. So what this is showing us, and let's just hit view all events, is this shows us all the moments, all the times in which our battery has been used as a redundant power source for the house, meaning that we lost power from the grid from a short blip or possibly a longer outage, and it shows us those events right here. So you can see back on February 20th, we had a relatively short one there, about 6 minutes. November 22nd, we had a large one. I remember this one. So we had a transformer that blew just outside of our neighborhood here that caused a power outage in this particular area. We stayed online the entire time and we were perfectly fine for that entire event. Didn't lose any power, didn't have to reset any time or clocks on the microwave anymore. So that was really nice that we were able to kind of sail through that no problem. And then you can see one back in September of last year and then June. And we can load more events here and you can see even older ones, December of 2023, August of 2023. These are all just little events that have occurred over the course. And I love seeing the history of this because this is really informative sometimes. And thankfully, we do live in an area where we don't get a lot of power outage. Ironically, just a few miles down the street, they seem to be plagued with quite a few outages, even like one a month, sometimes even more often than that. So not having to deal with those outages is kind of really nice. But at the same time, we're also not utilizing our Powerwall as well as we could be. But that's okay. We are ready for the instances where if we do get a hurricane, we do have a Powerwall that we can run the whole house off of, and of course solar to recharge that battery source. So it's really good to know that we have this capability. So there you go, backup history, and then we can go back. You can have a button here that goes completely off grid, which is kind of important, I guess, in some degrees. I'm not really sure, but you could just go completely off grid if you absolutely wanted to. Then here we have our settings, so we could go into settings, and here you can see we have some Powerwall settings here. Now, I mentioned this before that I keep my reserve at about 20%, and then I actually bump that up to 25% during the months of the shorter days. So December, January, February, those months I usually will bump this up to 25% because we never create enough energy from our solar to fill the batteries and fulfill whatever the house demand is during the day. So we usually just have that little extra buffer at the bottom of the pack in the event that we have a power outage and the battery is way down. It won't be any lower than 25%. Self-powered mode. Now, we used to use self-powered mode prior when our electricity rates were standard across the board. Same all day long, all week long, all month long, and pretty much the only adjustments they made was it was 12 cents per kilowatt hour during the 4 months of the year that were basically spring and summer. And then in the fall and the winter time, they usually made it about 10 cents a kilowatt hour. And we actually had some pretty cheap electricity rates here. We actually have really good electricity rates in this part of South Carolina. So that probably makes you wonder, well, why would you even bother with solar or even a battery backup to save money when the electricity rates are so low? Well, the answer to that is the electricity rates changed this year in 2025. And I knew this was going to happen 2 years ago when I was putting my batteries in. I knew that this adjustment was going to come, and this is a pretty large adjustment. And so here, let's dive in. I'm going to show you what that adjustment is and how it is affecting a lot of people, because I hear a lot of people, neighbors, friends, family, complaining about the cost of their electricity this year compared to previous years. So let's click on this utility rate plan, because you can see we're now time-based control because we do have those on-peak, off-peak hours. So let's go into our utility rate plan. You could see our times of year here. So November through March would be our 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. peak windows for the wintertime and months surrounding that. And basically what that means is that when you wake up in the morning, maybe you turn the heat on in your house because it's cold. You, of course, probably take a shower in the morning before work. This is when you're going to get hit with those peak hours. And then, of course, you see here under April and October, 3 p.m. to 6 p.m., which is what we're in right now, we have the same thing, just 3 hours in the afternoon when you get home from work, when you kick on the air conditioning a little bit lower, when you maybe cook some dinner in the oven. This is when you're going to get hit with these peak hours. Now you'll see here that our buy price is currently 8 cents per kilowatt hour off peak, and we're actually selling for about 4 cents per kilowatt hour if we were to sell back to the grid. So we're almost 50%. There's a little bit more decimal points after this, but we're almost 50% to sell back to the grid at this point. It used to be like 33%. Now we're almost 50%, which is okay, but it still should be a 1-to-1 in my opinion. Now, if we go down, you see the buy price during peak hours, I have set for 34 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, the reason I have this is just it's an arbitrary expensive number for price per kilowatt hour because we are actually on a demand fee structure for on-peak hours, meaning that we don't get charged by the kilowatt hour necessarily so much as we get charged by the kilowatt in that 3-hour window, the maximum kilowatt. So it's what they call an on-demand fee. And so what happens with that demand charge is we get charged a dollar amount multiplied by the maximum amount of kilowatts that we draw from the grid at a single time. So for instance, if you come home at work at 5 o'clock and you're in those peak hours, and let's say you turn on the oven, the air conditioner, maybe you even plug your electric vehicle in for a little bit, right? Well, let's say you take a maximum of 10 kilowatts from the grid. Now, we're not saying kilowatt hours here, kilowatts. So it's the maximum load that you're going to be taking from the grid at any one point. So if you take that 10 kilowatt load from the grid during peak hours and multiply it by the on-demand fee, which is $8, That's 8 times 10 kilowatt, which would give us an $80 demand charge for that day. Now, the thing about demand charge is that a lot of people don't understand is it's over the course of the entire month. So if you go, let's say, 30 days through the month without having really minimal, or let's say almost no demand charges from the grid because you're doing really well. Well, let's say day 31 hits and you forget or you slipped or you weren't thinking correctly and you did everything we just mentioned before and you pulled 10 kilowatts from the grid, right? Well, you're going to get hit with that $80 demand charge on the last day of your billing cycle because you slipped, because you forgot. And that's how demand charges work. Whether you use it on the first day of your billing cycle or the last day of your billing cycle, you're going to get hit with this demand charge for the entire month. Now, $80 during certain months of the year could be your entire electricity bill. So it could be almost double of what your electricity bill could normally be just because you used some electricity during those peak hours. And so that's something that I'm afraid that we're going to start seeing more and more and more. If this practice does catch on with more electricity companies, we might start seeing this shift where people are not paying a majority of their electricity bill from necessarily the amount of energy you use in kilowatt hours, but the load that you use at any particular time during the day. And they can use these windows during those peak hours just to target people in a specific case scenario, right? Majority of people are going to wake up somewhere between 6 and 9 a.m., use the shower, run the heat. We'll put that during the winter time. Most people are going to come home from work in the afternoon, run the AC, run their oven, whatever. We'll put those demand charges towards that time of the day. And so I could see a lot of opportunity here, unfortunately, for electricity company utilities to take advantage of their customers. All right, so we're just going back a little bit here. We could see under the advanced options, we have grid charging. Now, we do have grid charging enabled so we can actually charge from the grid. Now, when does grid charging become useful for somebody? Well, let's say you don't have solar, right? And you just have Tesla Powerwalls. Well, you're probably wondering, well, how does that save anybody money? Well, it's actually a pretty easy concept. If you live in an area where you have on-peak, off-peak hours, and you're trying to save some money on your electricity bill because you don't want to use electricity or minimal electricity during those on-peak hours. So what you can actually do is actually charge your Powerwall from the grid while it's off-peak or super off-peak, depending on where you live. And then once you get to peak hours, you can just use the Powerwall, essentially going off the grid and using just the electricity that you have stored up in your Powerwall. And so every day you're basically cycling through that and saying charge up on cheap and use it during the expensive time of the day. And that could, over the course of a month, save you quite a bit of money. So that is an option, as well as actually just having a Powerwall by itself without the usefulness of having the solar, but still save you money with just that battery. So we do have grid charging, and the way that this comes in handy is when you have let's say a cloudy day. It's really cloudy outside, your Powerwall's not really charging up from the sun all that much, and you really need some extra energy in your Powerwall. So you're at like 25%, and you're like, oh, we're coming up to our demand time of the day. We're not going to have enough to get through those 3 hours. So what we could do is we could charge up the Powerwall during that off-peak time, an hour or two beforehand, charge up the Powerwall, and then once we hit our 3 o'clock afternoon time, then all of a sudden we basically flip the switch, go off the grid, and then we could just work off of the electricity that we got cheap and work off of that during those peak hours. So there are some benefits of having that grid charging capability. So let's go back and talk about a couple other things real quick. So here you can see we have vehicle charging. We could set up our Powerwalls so we can, basically charge our vehicles off the Powerwalls if we want. We could put in a thing that says don't use any more than 25% of the Powerwall. So if we're over 75%, well, you can use some of that energy to charge up your car, no problem. But once you get below 75%, store that for the house itself, which would make sense, especially if we're trying to save that for the on-peak hours. There's again that charge on solar at the bottom there. Of course, we can charge on solar with our Tesla Model 3 with that universal wall connector. It's a really cool feature to have. And then, of course, we have Stormwatch. Now, for us in particular, we actually have Stormwatch disabled. And the reason for that is because I noticed before we actually moved over to these new demand hours that it seemed like Stormwatch would actually turn on during the peak hours of the day regardless. I've heard from other people in forums and stuff saying that regardless if it's off-peak or on-peak hours, the batteries will charge from the grid in order to prepare itself for an incoming storm. Now, this feature is awesome and I like it, but unfortunately I'm not willing to take the chance of my batteries charging off the grid during peak hours just for a potential power outage during a storm that we may have. And the last thing I wanted to point out on the app here is you could see that we are now producing about 3.5 kilowatts of solar. We have almost 10 kilowatts of demand right now from our house. And you could see that our grid, we're pulling 6.4 from the grid. And our Powerwall is staying exactly the same. We're not pulling from the Powerwall right now because the Powerwall is saying, hey, your peak hours are coming up soon. So we want to give you as much electricity as possible before we go into that. So we're not going to drain the Powerwall right before we hit those peak hours. We're going to sustain it. So that's why it's keeping that energy in the Powerwall, not using it from what I'm asking for right now. It's going to pull from the grid because the grid is so cheap. Now this brings on a couple things that I wish to see improved on the Tesla Powerwalls, which is maybe a little bit more customization for this particular situation. Number one, we don't have a way of setting up the peak hours being a demand charge, right? So I can only put in that number, that just arbitrary 34 cents a kilowatt hour number, because there is no way for me to put in that between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. there is a demand charge from the grid. That functionality does not exist. And I actually called Tesla to confirm this, and I asked them, what is the best way to set up my Powerwalls with a demand charge? And they gave me some suggestions, in which some of those I've put into place, and I've also adjusted myself over the course of the last few months of testing. And so that was one thing that I wish they would put in, is pretty much saying never ever pull from the grid during those hours unless it is 100% necessary, because that's where a big majority of your cost, your monthly cost can be associated, is during those 3 hours per day. Another thing that I'd like to see done is thresholds be put in place for what you would like to have percentage-wise going into your 3-hour on-demand window and possibly coming out of that 3-hour window. So for instance, if I say I would like a minimum of 60% to get through that 3-hour window, well, then what should happen is, let's say I charge up the battery to 85%. It's now 3 o'clock, we're into the demand window, and we are now coasting through that demand window. And let's say I come out of that demand window at 6 o'clock and I still have 70% in my battery, right? Well, I don't necessarily need 75% in my battery for the next day at 3 p.m. 60% is more than adequate. So I should be able to use that 15% from 75%, wherever it lands, use that from the battery throughout the night into the next day, and then get to that 60% mark and hold there. And I like for that to be more customizable, so I can say just use about 60%. And then of course we'd have some extra play in the battery to basically use towards the house, so we're not always pulling from the grid. Because what I notice is that sometimes in the middle of the day, when we're not home, so we can't use any stuff in the house, that the battery will be holding at 75% state of charge. Well, over the course of the day, while we're charging using our solar, we're going to max out the battery. And then we're going to start sending that back to the grid, which, as you saw, we only get about half the cost. So it would be great to be able to use some of the battery by choice prior to the following day. So this way we know we can use some of that battery for our benefit to save some money, and then we have the whole next day of solar to charge up the battery back to our minimal threshold. Because it wouldn't be a bad thing for me to start my day at about 30%, charge up the battery using solar all the way up to about 3 o'clock, and then if for some reason we happen to go above that 60%, that's great. We can use some of that towards the end of the day or overnight in those hours, as opposed to it holding at that 75 or 80% or whatever it is all the way through the night and into the next morning. Anyway, that is my 2 years experience owning Tesla Powerwall 2s in my house. Now, we haven't had that many power outages to really put them to the test, but now, as you can see, with our new changes in our electricity company's rates, we are now saving quite a bit of money every single month. And I estimate we're probably saving close to $50 to $75 a month just on demand fees from our electricity company by having the battery. Because every month when I get my electricity bill, it says demand fee, 0 kilowatts, $0. And that is something that is awesome to see, not having to pay for these demand charges every single month. Of course, they always get us every month if we ever do send electricity back by only giving us half. So that's why it's extremely important to maximize every kilowatt hour that we produce, and we use it to our own benefits before we send it back to the electricity company. But anyway, I'm curious to hear what you think. Now, this is obviously a huge investment, right? This is not something that you're just going to put on your house and then you're going to move in a couple of years. Or you're not going to put solar on your roof if you have an old roof. 5 years ago, we took the jump to put a new roof on our house and at the same time do solar. And just a couple of years ago, when we put the Powerwalls in place, I knew we were going to see some major changes from our electricity company, which is why I wanted to do the investment into the solar and the Powerwalls, because we're going to be here for a pretty long time. We're not planning on leaving anytime soon. So that's why this was an investment. And you're not going to get your money back in 2 years or 5 years. It could be 8, 9, maybe even 10 years to get your money back on the solar and the batteries. But knowing that every single month I can control everything that I do in my house, since we are completely electric, including our vehicles, so we don't pay a dime for gas every month. And our electricity bill is still well under $200, even in the peak seasons of summer. So it's really good to see that we can produce our own fuel for our cars, our own electricity for our houses. Anyway, I'm curious to hear what you think about this. Are you a current solar customer thinking about a battery? Are you a current Tesla Powerwall owner and you're just curious about what other people's experience was? Or are you still thinking about doing the whole thing altogether? Are you thinking about doing solar and battery? Let me know. Put it down in the comments. I'm curious to hear what you have to say. Anyway, I'd like to thank you very much for watching this episode today. Of course, we'll catch you on the next one. And if you have any suggestions for any future Tesla Powerwall videos you'd like me to do, make sure you leave those in the comments as well. Thanks everybody for watching. We'll see you on the next one. And remember, welcome to the future. Welcome to Tech Motoring. We'll see you soon.